Welcome back to part 2 of the new California Association of Realtors forms. This is Kasama Lee, your community realtor. This week, we're going to be diving into the seller side of the forms, the new stuff and the new elements that are required. I'm going to be going through the screen, showing you the forms and walking you through the process. If you missed the first part of this episode, last week we talked about the forms required by the buyer. So this week we're going to spend time on the residential listing agreement and the buyer broker agreement. I want to put out the disclaimer to you that I am not a real estate forms trainer. My expertise comes from years of having been a real estate agent. The way that I'm explaining it is how we would be explaining it to our clients as we go through the process. So please keep that in mind. I would highly encourage you, if you are a seller, to read through the entirety of the forms and ask any questions you may have to your trusted real estate agent or realtor that you have hired to work with. Okay? So let's get started. We're going to dive right into it. But before we begin, if you find this type of content valuable, you want to hit subscribe and the bell notification so you don't miss future videos that could be helpful to you. And thank you for sharing the content to those that could benefit from it so that we could continue to grow this channel as well. All right. Let's take a look. According to National Association of Realtors, for home sellers, here's what the NAR settlement means for you. As a home seller, you have a wide range of choices when it comes to listing your home. Agents who are realtors are a trusted source of advice and stand ready to help you navigate this complex process and make the choices that work best for you. NAR's recent settlement has led to several changes related to broker commissions that benefit sellers, and we wanted to clearly lay them out for you. Here's what the settlement means for home sellers. You still have the choice of offering compensation to buyer brokers. You may consider doing this as a way of marketing your home or making your listing more attractive to buyers. This is important because although it is a choice, and it's also a choice to eliminate making compensation available to the buyer brokers altogether, what that does is it would eliminate, it would decrease the pool of potential buyers' agents if they're not able to get compensation from the buyer side. And you can refer back to last week's video. This would decrease the pool of potential buyers that would be seeing your home. So that's important for you to keep in mind. Next point, your agent must conspicuously disclose to you and obtain your approval for any payment or offer of payment that a listing broker will make to another broker acting for buyers. This disclosure must be made to you in writing in advance of any payment or agreement to pay another broker acting for buyers, and must specify the amount or rate of such payment. So the difference now is that you don't decide on what you're paying the buyer's broker until the offer comes in with the submission requesting for the compensation. Okay, so it's not something that's predetermined up front when you sign the listing agreement. And you'll see that in the next moment here. If you choose to approve an offer of compensation, there are changes to how this can happen. You as a seller can still make an offer compensation, but your agent cannot include it on multiple listing service. It cannot be showing on the MLS basically. MLSs are local marketplaces used by both buyer brokers and listing brokers to share information about the properties for sale. Your agent can advertise your listing via off-MLS platforms such as social media, flyers, and websites. You as a seller can still offer buyer concession on an MLS, for example, concessions for buyer closing costs. This settlement practice changes will go into effect August 17th, which has already taken place. Here is what the settlement doesn't change. Agents who are realtors are here to help you navigate the process of selling your home and are ethically obligated to work in your best interest. That's our fiduciary responsibility. Compensation for your agent remains fully negotiable, and if your agent is a realtor, they must abide by the Realtor Code of Ethics and have clear and transparent discussions with you about compensation. When finding an agent to work with, ask questions about compensation and discuss what you would like to offer buyers. You have choices. Work with your agent to understand the full range of these choices when selling your home, which will help you make the best possible decision for your needs. Now we're going to go to the residential listing agreement. So you start with the date, the document is prepared, and then, the name of the seller, the property, location, and the assessor's parcel number, which is the unique ID number that ties to the property. A1 talks about listing period. This is where the beginning and ending of the listing agreement would be, okay? And that is going to be specific to how the agent works this. The maximum length cannot exceed 24 months. A2 is where the listing price would be. Now, oftentimes we let the seller know that this may be the listing price that we put as a benchmark now, and it can change subject to the seller's approval until, the day before it goes live on the MLS, because there may be new sold comps that showed up and we may adjust the price according to that. But that field should also be completed. Item C, it talks about compensation. Notice the amount or rate of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between seller and broker. C1 4B, compensation to seller's broker. This is where the percentage would be put in there. This would be the compensation only to the seller's broker, your listing agent only. This does not stipulate what the seller, would consider agreeing to pay or compensate the buyer's broker. That would be on a different form, okay? Specifically, once again, this is a percentage being paid to the seller's broker, the agent that you have hired to sell your home only. C2, 4C, additional compensation to seller's broker if buyer is unrepresented. There could be an additional percentage placed here if your listing agent ends up working with an unrepresented buyer, which means they're not represented by an agent. Now, I don't recommend that personally, and I would advise that to my client. It can happen, but it's such a liability for a buyer to come in with no representation. I don't know why that would be the case. I don't know how the forms are going to be prepared. Really, this is a new field. Okay, so I'll be honest with you. I would probably guide the unrepresented buyer to become a represented buyer. But there could be, that's a field where additional compensation could be paid to the seller's broker if they have to do the extra work to prepare this unrepresented buyer. So that's negotiable between you, the seller, and your agent. C3, 4D2, continuation of right to compensation for broker identify prospective buyers. If the buyer had come through during the listing agreement period, which is specified in A1, and they decided to move forward, the buyer decides to move forward with the seller's broker would still be entitled to compensation because the procurement, the original work, was done during the listing period. And, in our case, we put the default of 90 days after the listing agreement has expired. What's included and what's excluded is something that you discuss with your agent to the property, okay? MLS Item E, MLS and public market. Property will be marketed in the following MLS. In our area, it's called Bay Area Real Estate Information Services. Second page, item F1, 7B, timing of presentation of offer. Seller, you as a seller could instruct the broker to represent all offer received as soon as they become available, or hold off and have them all be presented on a certain date and time. This is more the case that if you are anticipating multiple offers coming in. Okay, again, that's to be discussed with your agent, how you prefer to review offers. F2, 7C, buyer supplemental offer letters. Seller instructs broker not to present buyer letters, or if checked, seller instruct brokers to present buyer's letters. If seller requests or relies on buyer letters, seller is acting against broker's advice. This is what we used to call love letters, right? The buyer would send you a love letter sharing the story of, who they are and so on and so forth. And that has been advised not to be presented by National Association of Realtors. But the seller does have the option to instruct the seller's broker to present the letter if the letter is submitted, okay? F37E, investigation reports. The one thing that the seller is required to provide to the buyer as a disclosure is the natural hazard disclosure. And again, if you have questions about some of these things, I would defer you to speak to your real estate agent about details. Item H, if seller intends to include a contingency to purchase a replacement property as part of the transaction, we need to disclose that as well, okay? Item J, seller, if they opt out, they don't want the yard sign or lockbox installed, those boxes would be checked. Item K, additional terms. This is where we normally would share what we are paying for out of pocket upfront, okay? Every agent is different, so you're gonna need to discuss that with your agent. Item 3A, advisories, broker compensation advisory is attached, and we're going to go through that as a third part of the document here. Talks about compensation and terms. I would suggest that you read through all of these terms, okay? Last page is where page 7 of the residential listing agreement is where the seller would sign the listing agreement. Okay. So next form is the multiple listing service addendum, okay? This form has to do with the seller's instruction on how the property is going to be listed on the MLS, whether the seller is considering compensation to the buyer's broker, okay? So you have the property information, and it talks about what an MLS is. I would suggest you read through these clearly. It's pretty self-explanatory. Talks about the benefits of having your property on the MLS. Now, if you go to page 2, item 5B, seller authorization. Okay, this has to do with seller concessions and seller authorization. If you look at item 5B, you will see that number 1, seller does not authorize broker to put on the MLS that the seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions. In order to consider the concession, you have to have B2 box checked, and it's read, seller authorizes broker to put in the MLS that seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions if allowed under the MLS rules. Even if permitted by the MLS, no amount of the possible concession will be stated in the MLS, either as a percent of the purchase price or a flat fee, unless seller notifies broker in writing of the amount. So here is when this box is checked, it's going to display on the MLS so that what shows up for the buyer's agent is it shows that seller is willing to consider concession, including compensation to the buyer's broker, without you obligating to saying how much or anything like that. And then the seller would sign at the bottom of page 2. Last document is the broker compensation advisory, and we're going to go through it here. This gets shared on the buyer side and the seller side as well. So it talks about listing agreement compensation is fully negotiable. This is very important that this gets stated, okay? And it was there before, but now because of the NAR settlement, the language is even more spelled out, okay? Optional additional compensation if the buyer is unrepresented. A listing agreement may include optional additional compensation amounts owed to the seller's broker for situations where the broker takes on additional responsibilities or workload. Sometimes a buyer may not be working with nor want to be represented by a real estate broker. Now, I don't know why that would be the case. It's a huge liability, in my opinion, that a buyer would be unrepresented. And who's representing them? Are they representing themselves? Do they know what forms to use? Do they have access to the forms? I'm not really sure if this is a healthy option for any party involved. That's just my personal opinion as a disclosure, okay? But because the additional work that may be required by the seller's agent to facilitate this unrepresented buyer, there may be additional work involved. In those situations, the broker is advised to use a buyer non-agency form, which is a different other form, and there may be additional compensation pre-negotiated due to the seller's agent if this is the case. All right, so broker may present both buyer and seller. This is called dual agency. Now, you can read through this, okay? But basically, this could be, for example, a buyer that the listing agent basically is the agent representing the seller. Maybe the buyer is someone that they had been working with prior to taking on this listing. So it was already their client, right? So it's possible that the agent ends up representing both parties. In our definition, Remax Gold is quite a large franchise brokerage. And even if there's another agent from Remax Gold that represents the buyer on the other side, that's also considered dual agency. It's perfectly acceptable. Broker agreements with buyers. Buyer representation compensation is fully negotiable when a buyer enters into a representation agreement with the broker. The buyer authorizes the broker to locate properties for the buyer to buy and agrees to pay the buyer's broker if a transaction is completed. Compensation amounts are not fixed by law and are fully negotiable. When negotiating compensation, the parties may discuss factors such as the broker's expertise and experience, the type of broker's services to be performed, and the broker's time and expenses, among other considerations. Requirement for written agreements. Pursuant to a nationwide class action settlement that you may have heard about, participants in multiple listing services are required to have a written agreement with the buyer prior to showing a buyer residential property or giving a buyer a tour of such a property. The agreement must identify the amount of compensation to be paid to the broker for services provided and require that the broker cannot receive any compensation in excess of the amount specified in the agreement. In other words, the broker cannot be working a little side additional compensation outside of what is stated in the buyer-broker agreement, okay? And we're going to see that next form in just a little bit. Pursuant to legislation expected to become law in California on January 1, 2025, all licenses showing a buyer any type of property will be required to have a written agreement with that buyer prior to the showing. So we now, at least, at Remax Gold, we are now required to have the representation agreement signed with the buyer before we can even show the first property, okay? And that's also in our local area. Advantages for written agreement. Buyers and their brokers benefit when terms of their relationship and respective duties are in writing upfront, right? A written agreement establishes a clear mutual expectations and helps avoid misunderstandings over the buyer and broker's duties and the amount of compensation the buyer's agent is to be paid. In other words, no surprises, right? When enlisting a real estate broker to represent them, buyers agree to pay the buyer's broker when escrow closes, but the person responsible for payment may be negotiated in the transaction. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where you need to pay close attention, okay? Yes, buyer pays the compensation pursuant to a buyer representation agreement. A buyer's broker may negotiate the amount of compensation directly with the buyer and then document that agreement in a buyer representation agreement. The buyer then becomes contractually obligated to pay the broker by providing funds to escrow prior to the closing of a transaction. This is where the room of negotiation is and where the funds could be coming from, okay? 3B, seller pays the compensation. Buyer negotiates for seller to compensate buyer's broker. A buyer may make a conditional offer to the seller by including a term in the purchase offer asking the seller to pay the buyer's broker if the buyer has already agreed to pay their own broker pursuant to a buyer representation agreement. If such a term is included in the purchase offer, the request will become one term among many that the seller may accept, reject, or negotiate by way of a counteroffer. Okay, so don't get overwhelmed with all these words, okay? All it means is that the compensation to the buyer broker needs to be written in as an attachment to the offer. And whether it's a flat fee, whether it's a percentage, the seller can negotiate through a counteroffer of that request. That funds then become funds that would get paid or compensated out to the buyer broker at close of escrow. That's the big change in the process, okay? In other words, the seller has the right to consider and negotiate what the buyer broker compensation would be upfront. Okay? When the offer gets submitted, of course. Buyer's agent negotiates an agreement directly with seller. If a seller is unrepresented or does not have an exclusive agency relationship with other broker, a buyer's broker may approach the seller asking the seller to sign an agreement. This basically speaks about for sale by owners. You know, when we say unrepresented, the seller does not have representation. It would be a direct negotiation by the buyer's agent to the seller directly. That's 3B2, okay? And that's pretty much the meat of the broker compensation advisory.